In 1975, Stephen King published his second novel, Salem's Lot. Terrifying vampire story, in which a small town gets plagued by vampires. The story was then adapted into a 3-hour TV miniseries in 1979, starring David Soul and James Mason, and directed by legendary horror filmmaker Tobe Hooper. And then adapted once again in 2004 in another miniseries airing on TNT, and starring Rob Lowe, Donald Sutherland and Rutger Hauer. Salem's Lot tells the story of author Ben Mears returning to his hometown of Salem's Lot, only to find that a sinister old man called Mr. Straker has moved into the Marston house, a creepy old house that overlooks the town, a house in which Mears believes is evil and also attracts evil people. And not too long after, many of the residents of Salem's Lot start falling victim to a mysterious disease, which sees them become blood-sucking creatures of the night, aka vampires. Mears is sure that the evil force behind the vampire outbreak is Mr. Straker, along with his business partner, the mysterious Mr. Barlow. Now I'm not gonna lie, but the original 1979 Salem's Lot miniseries scared the hell out of me back in the day. Oh, hell, it still does now. I mean, that scene with a little vampire boy is scratching on the window? Ugh. Every time I watch that scene, I end up going to bed with my nightlight on. So anyway, today we are going to explore 10 things that you probably didn't know about Salem's Lot. The classic Stephen King story about vampires. So let's not waste any time and sink our teeth right into it. Number 10. Stephen King got the idea from reading Dracula. Yes, it was while reading Dracula in English class that King first started to get the idea forming in his head for Salem's Lot. The story of Dracula inspired King to wonder, what if vampires came to a small town in America? Now, although having books and movies and TV shows about vampires in modern suburbia may seem common these days, but back then, vampire stories mainly took place in creepy castles, often in Europe, and usually they were often period pieces, with scenery that looked more like something out of a Universal monster movie or Hammer horror film. So it was quite a revolutionary idea of having vampires invading modern-day America. Also, I can't help but feel like King made the vampire mythology look more like a plague, where, just like a plague or virus, the inhabitants of Salem's Lot get infected, with the infection spreading on a mass scale.
It's a geometric progression, 2 times 2 times 4 times 8.
And even in the 1979 miniseries, I can't help but feel like the vampires looked diseased. Let's just say the vampires in 1979 weren't as desirable like they tend to be nowadays. Unless you find this blue guy sexy, of course? I don't know, who knows. Number 9. Salem's Lot originally had a different title. Considering that a huge focus of Salem's Lot story is about the character Ben Mears returning to his hometown, that was probably the motivation behind King's original title for the book, which was Second Coming. Yep, at one stage, this scary story about vampires was called Second Coming. But King then decided to change the title, thanks to his wife, as she felt that Second Coming sounded like a, quote, bad sex story. So King then changed the name to Jerusalem's Lot, and then shortened it down to Salem's Lot. Good call to Stephen King's wife, because let's be honest, she's right. Second Coming does sound like a sex story which features someone who's not quite up to par. Number 8. Mr. Barlow was drastically redesigned from the original miniseries. In the 1979 miniseries, the character of Mr. Barlow looked like a terrifying creature of the night, nothing short of a snarling, hissing monster. Thanks to his tall, slim build, bald head, pointy ears, blue skin, and mouthful of grotesque, sharp teeth, there is nothing subtle about this on-screen evil villain.
I'm going to kill you!
You know by looking at him that this is a ferocious creature that will kill you. The look of Mr. Barlow in the miniseries was based on the original Nosferatu look, a tradition being associated with vampires since the early days of cinema. However, in the original novel, Mr. Barlow isn't a snarling creature, but in fact more of a noble, well-spoken, well-dressed gentleman. In other words, a pretty slick, smooth-talking vampire. The reason it was decided to make Barlow look more like Nosferatu in the 1979 miniseries was an attempt by the production team of returning vampires to looking like the essence of evil, and quote, not anything romantic or smarmy. King's original vision of Barlow was fully realised in the 2004 remake. Maybe I'm just biased to the 1979 miniseries, but I just prefer the idea of Salem's Lot being attacked by a creepy old man and his evil creature that he keeps locked up. Otherwise, it just comes across that the town is being taken over by two old chaps, yes. You know, two wise old guys who actually don't look that threatening. Having a secret, monstrous-looking creature locked up just makes the story that bit more intimidating. Number 7. Mr. Barlow might be Pennywise. As any Stephen King fan would know, his books often do cross paths, with characters from novels he has written showing up in other novels that he has written, and thus suggesting his books are based in one big universe. This leads us to his most talked about story, It, in which there is a scene that suggests that Pennywise and Barlow might in fact be one and the same. In the novelisation of It, there is a sequence where Pennywise disguises himself as a vampire. The vampire's description sounds near identical to that of Mr. Barlow, from his Salem's Lot book. So what do you guys think? Could these evil villains be one and the same? Or could Pennywise have summoned up Barlow's likeness from the Macroverse? Number 6. The miniseries was re-edited into a theatrical movie version. Tobe Hooper's Salem's Lot miniseries was so impressive and had such a cinematic quality about it, it was decided to trim the movie down into an hour-and-a-half running time and release the movie in cinemas as a theatrical release in Europe. After all, this isn't the only time this has happened. The same thing happened in the early 70s with Steven Spielberg's TV movie Duel. However, I was never a fan of the movie version, as it cuts so much out of the miniseries, along with a whole entire subplot about Ben Mears and Mark Petrie living as vampire hunters in Guatemala being entirely removed. However, with its European cinematic release came with it the alternative titles, such as Bloodthirst, Phantasma 2, which by the way is really weird considering that Salem's Lot isn't a sequel, and of course the Italian renaming of the Knights of Salem. Number 5. George A. Romero was originally on board to direct. After the huge success of the movie adaptation of Carrie, Warner Brothers were keen to produce a movie version of Salem's Lot, and none other than the godfather of zombies himself, George A. Romero, was showing interest in directing the movie. However, it was decided to make Salem's Lot a TV miniseries instead of a movie, on the account that in the year of 1979, there was already 2 vampire movies out, one being a revamp, no pun intended, of Dracula, and the other one being a Nosferatu retelling called Nosferatu My Vampire. So fearing the competition, it was opted to be a TV project instead. However, this caused Romero to leave the project, as he felt he would be too restricted by TV network guidelines for his vision to be fully realised. Australian filmmaker Peter Weir was considered for director, But let's be honest, he probably would have had the vampires go on picnics and then vanish inside a rock. Tobe Hooper was hired due to his work on a Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and hiring him and his vision definitely gave the TV miniseries that extra edge it needed. And the irony of all this is that Salem's Lot started up the trend of many of Stephen King's stories being adapted into TV miniseries. A practice that is still going on these days. Yep, it all started all the way back with Salem's Lot. Number 4. Bizarre sequel. When it comes to live adaptations of Salem's Lot, it seems that we all know about the 1979 version and the 2004 one. But in 1987, there was actually a theatrical sequel to the original miniseries called A Return to Salem's Lot. And, well, it was pretty batshit insane. Even though A Return to Salem's Lot literally just recycled the original movie's poster, seriously, how lazy is this? It in no way feels like a sequel, more like a sequel in name only. Written and directed by Larry Cohen of The Stuff fame, and filmed on what looks like a shoestring budget, it tells the story of vampires who inhabit a town, and their desire for being a community and having their story heard. Yep, a civilized society of vampires. The ideas were actually interesting and even intriguing. I mean, after all, it's probably the only film to dive into the politics of a town of vampires. And the movie is not god-awful or anything, but it really shouldn't be bearing the title Salem's Lot, as it's not really a sequel. That, and it's got a very young Tara Reid in it, and it doesn't get any weirder than that. Number 3, The Trouble with Mr. Barlow's Makeup. Although Mr. Barlow may have been a memorable creature of the night in the original Salem's Lot miniseries, apparently creating his monstrous look was anything but easy, as Tobe Hooper said that the makeup the actor was wearing constantly needed fixing up, on the account that it kept cracking and falling off. In particular, Barlow's death scene in his coffin was cited as being really difficult to shoot, on the account that the makeup was constantly having to be fixed. The actor who played him, Reggie Nolder, even said wearing the eyes were painful and took a while to get used to. Speaking of Nolder, he would go on to say that he was disappointed with the final product of the TV miniseries, as he said there were many more scenes involving his vampire that were cut out. Damn, I would really love to see those missing scenes. I mean, I think that his appearance is perfect in Salem's Lot, and that sometimes less is more. But I would still like to see them, just for curiosity's sake. Number 2, inspired Swedish rock album cover. One thing that always seems to stand out to me in regards to Salem's Lot is its promotional poster. It looks so haunting and intimidating as we see a giant Barlow looming over the Marston house. It's no doubt become a piece of classic movie poster history, so it's not hard to imagine that this poster has influenced other artists, namely Swedish rock band Ghost, and their first album, Opus Eponymus. And it's not hard to see that the album cover is heavily influenced by the Salem's Lot movie poster. Oh, don't mind me, I always do this pose when I have indigestion. And before we get to number 1, here are some bonus facts. Bonus fact number 1, failed TV series. Due to the massive success of the Salem's Lot miniseries, there was a planned follow-up TV series based on Salem's Lot, but sadly it never took place. Bonus fact number 2. This was the second time that David Soul had to battle a TV vampire. First time was in Starsky and Hutch, in an episode incidentally enough called Vampire, about a killer who had some rather vampiric ways of killing his victims. And bonus number 3, Stephen King always wanted Ben Mears to be played by Ben Gazzara, aka that little weedy guy who picks on Patrick Swayze in Roadhouse. Yeah, just imagine Wesley versus the vampires of Salem's Lot. Number 1, the Marston house is an actual prop. The Marston house seen in Salem's Lot is almost like a character itself. It was meant to look like something terrifying and foreboding, almost like an entity, imposing dread on the town below. And to be honest, I always assumed that it was a real house, but in fact it was just a massive prop. The house prop, which was clearly based on Mother's house from Psycho, cost $100,000 to build. And although it looks like a house thanks to the convincing angles it was filmed in, it was actually more structured like a flat billboard, as you can see from this old rare behind the scenes photo. So next time you watch Salem's Lot, you can do so knowing that the house isn't really a house, but rather a very impressive effect for its time. Well guys, that was me look into Salem's Lot, the story that actually modernized the vampire mythos. It's one of my favourite vampire tales and one of my favourite Stephen King stories. And nothing will ever replace the awesome spine-tingling terror that I felt the first time I watched the 1979 miniseries. Oh yes. Anyway, I'm Minty, and ciao. It's Italian for a goodbye. Yeah.